I said everything gonna be alright. I said everything will be alright.
We hope everything's going to be all right. Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome to Indoor Air Quality Radio, IAQ Radio, for Friday, September 2nd, 2016. This week is episode 429. My name is Radio Joe Hughes, and this week's guest will be Dr. J. David Miller. We're going to talk a little bit about allergens and mold today and what practitioners should know. But before we get started, we want to thank our marquee sponsors.
John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at their website, jondon.com. That's jondon.com.
Clean Facts, the number one information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfactswithanx.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their services and products.
Okay, and last but not least, please check out the IAQ Training Institute website for the most current dates for the training you trust at IAQtraining.com. Let's turn it over to the Z-Man for today's IAQ Radio trivia question.
Thanks, Joe. Win a cool prize by outcompeting fellow IAQ Radio listeners and being the first person to correctly answer the IAQ Radio trivia question each week. Submitting your answer is easy. Either email it to czlotnick@cs.com, or if you're listening to the show live, you can text in the answer via your computer. Congratulations. To John Lapotere, IAQ Solutions in Orlando, Florida, for answering last week's IAQ Radio trivia question. The IAQ Radio trivia question for today, Friday, September 2nd, 2016, has been sponsored by Ideas, the solution chemistry company creating unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Now for this week's IAQ Radio trivia question. What is the common name for seasonal allergic rhinitis? Back to you, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Today's guest is J. David Miller. Professor Miller is also a PhD. He did his secondary training at the, University of New Brunswick before studying at the University of Portsmouth in England, where he was also a NATO Science postdoctoral fellow. He began his post-university career at Agriculture Canada in 1982 and became head of the Fusarium mycotoxin program in 1988. He became a professor and a research chair at Carleton University in 2000, and from 1998 to 2008, he was a visiting scientist and science advisor in the Air Health Effects section of Health Canada. His work involves the development of methods to assess exposure to the determinants of respiratory health in indoor environments and on fungal toxins in food and feed. He's published over 300 papers on fungi and fungal toxins and has co-written 9 books on public health aspects of exposure to fungi and has several patents. He has served on many national and international committees on mold and dampness in the built environment, and currently he serves on the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Committee that produces practice parameters for environmental allergens, and that's what we want to talk a lot about today. Let's first get some music to welcome Dr. Miller.
Growing mold in my heart, growing mold in my brain, growing mold all around me and feeding me away.
All right, Dr. Miller, do we have you?
Oh, yeah, I'm still here. I was wondering if I was allowed to answer Cliff's question, but
Well,
I'll give it a pass.
Yeah. Actually, I think someone already got it.
Yep.
I bet.
People are fast. Yeah.
It was
I bet they're a sufferer, too. So.
They may be. They may be.
Am.
But you can give the answer because someone already gave it. So, okay.
Well, at least I would call it hay fever.
There you
That's
go.
correct.
They got it. All right. Well, let's start. You know, I saw you at the microbiology.
And thank you, Cliff, for a subject matter appropriate question.
No problem.
Well done. All right, we talked at the Microbiology of the Built Environment Conference that was in Boulder this year, and I mentioned to you then, I still think every IAQ practitioner should hear what you talked about. So, can you summarize for our listeners some of the, what your presentation was on and some of the key points?
Yeah, well, of course, as all of you know, that scientists and academics were, the first thing I want to say is here's my first slide, but we don't have that today. I think Joe, the last time I was on your program, we were talking about likely the Green Book from the AIHA.
Yes.
And I think the first point I'd want to make is that probably everybody in this audience at the present time, or ultimately listen to this, comes from a different perspective. Some folks are worry and work on the industrial hygiene part of it in non-industrial workplaces and homes. Other people, focus on home inspections and try to, fix problems with IAQ with in that context. Other people are, remediators, address problems a lot with mold, I suppose. And so we all have a different perspective, and I think the first the thing that was a little bit different about my what you heard in Boulder was I was talking about how now the physicians are looking at a world that we've been all trying to wade around in in many cases for decades. When a patient has allergic disease, they normally go, of course, to an allergist. And the way allergy doctors and other medical professionals address their treatment and diagnosis and treatment of different illnesses is that they depend normally on what they learned in medical school, of course, but also that they depend on good advice from cognizant authorities, and that can come from institutions like the Institute of Medicine or the WHO, but very often it comes from their own professional organizations. Much like in industrial hygiene, we depend a lot on what AIHA and ACJH has to say. So I shared with the group, and we'll talk a bit about this today, a process that began actually in 2008 when the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology set about to, in one case or one or two cases, update some of what are called clinical practice parameters, but do new clinical practice parameters on the allergens that occur in buildings. And we don't really think about that all that much in industrial hygiene, but yet it's extremely important in buildings. And so what these parameters are, and I described the really quite arduous process of creating them, is an expert committee is created. Hundreds, in some cases thousands, of scientific publications are examined by the group, and then over about a 18-month period, an analysis is done, working very hard, I should say, to figure out how would you best diagnose someone who was allergic to the allergens under discussion. How would you treat them? What is the best way? And because we were dealing with the built environment, what are the things about the built environment that might favor those allergens, and therefore what kind of advice should you give to patients? And that once that is drafted, then it's reviewed by a main committee, if you like, and then it goes out to peer review all over the world, really. But it goes to, in this case, 10,000 allergy doctors in North America or in the world that belong, and they're all entitled to comment, much like in a government regulation. And then, of course, as you would imagine, all that is addressed, and then the parameter gets ultimately approved, and then it's submitted for publication, and the whole peer review process begins again. So what we did was we looked at furry pets. So I think most people know that dogs and cats and other pets make allergens, and there's stuff to say about that. The second one that was done was on rodents. So that we see mice and rats in buildings, of course, and so there's occupational issues with rodents. And then the third one was about cockroaches, and of course that's a pretty nearly exclusively built environment context, so there's quite a bit about buildings there. And there we started to introduce ideas about, how do you evaluate the qualifications of someone who's trying to sell you, in this case, integrated pest management or chemicals or whatever for dealing with cockroaches. And try to give that advice to physicians so that they when they recognize that there's allergy to cockroaches and inflammatory consequences to a cockroach exposure, that you do tell the patient that you need to be careful in choosing the person who might come in and do the treatments and so on. So that's all analyzed out. These are all open access, so you can read them. And then the third one, the third one, which I would like to spend some time on, is the house dust mite parameter. And then finally, we produced some material on fungi.
Okay, so and these are what I would commonly refer to as the AAAI, I believe it is, practice parameters.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, and then you started.
Well, we usually say quad AI. Yeah.
Quad AI. Okay, that'll help.
Yeah. It makes it easier, doesn't it, Joe?
It's a mouthful. So I think the next thing that really caught my attention was your discussion of dust mite, and you mentioned that that was one of these practice parameters, and you talked a little bit about the history of it, and I wonder if you could tell listeners a little bit more about the dust mite, where they came from,
sure,
and where they're at now, and so on.
So, I mean, it is a really interesting story for us in North America. I think it's astounding. So I feel sure that almost everyone listening today knows that dust mites cause allergy and asthma. In fact, it's one of the things we know that causes asthma, house dust mite allergen. What is at least interesting to me is that the idea that house dust mite allergen could cause asthma was first discussed in Holland and in Japan about the same time, in the middle of the 60s, about towards the middle to late 1960s. And at that time, it was, of course, considered a wild and crazy idea, much like mold could cause health problems.
Huh.
And at 15 years ago, it was really considered so far out there that what are these crazy people talking about in Holland and Japan? There lots of work had to be done, and it wasn't really until 1988 that it was agreed by the WHO, the World Health Organization, that house dust mite allergens did in fact cause asthma. So it took a very long time, which was, people argued, and I got to see some of this when I was a graduate student in the UK, as people, took sides and, got mad, just like many other things with the built environment. So it took a very long time. And how was that done? Well, firstly, someone had to kind of make the association. In the case of the two house dust mite species, they had to discover the allergen, and that allowed it to be measured in buildings, and it allowed antibodies in the affected individuals to be measured in humans. So really critical steps that had to be gone through in the journey of science. Being able to measure the exposure that you're trying to blame, if you like, or attribute disease or an outcome to in the environment, that took a long time. And then being able to measure the effect in the human, not in terms of it in the air or something like that. So that's normally what it takes to make these causal linkages. In North America, in the United States and Canada, astoundingly, I think, to many people, it was not until 1969 in Canada and 1970 in the United States that house dust mites were reported in houses at all. And at that time they were rare, at least from the measurements. And so just remember the timeline. The Dutch were working on this in the middle-ish 60s. So a couple of scientists in the United States and Canada started to look for these little mites in at least the northern part of our two countries. I mean, the southern part of Canada and the northern, above the Mason-Dixon line, let's just say, in the United States. And indeed, they were rare. And I've been measuring house dust mite allergen and big housing studies in Canada for a long time. And when I started in the sort of 84, 85 period, they were fairly commonly present, but not in any great amount and not in every house. So from 1969, when they were rare, they got a little bit more common by the early-ish 80s, but by the time I was looking at houses in the middle of the 90s, they were everywhere. And why did that happen? Well, they're little tropical insects that, at least genetically, come from near Australia. And when we tightened our buildings up and, allowed, put carpets in or wall-to-wall carpets and didn't clean the fine dust, and when we increased the humidity and the temperature, we converted a generally hostile environment in our houses to these little mites to a very happy home indeed. And so thus, in almost all our homes in some parts of North America, you can count on the fact that there are dust mites. When I was a child, you wouldn't have been able to find any because the houses leaked so much air that they were dry and, cold probably too. So it's a really interesting thing that for something that causes much of the asthma on the coasts of our countries in the southern part of the United States, meaning all but the hard Midwest, hard West in the center, in the and up in the mountains in the Rockies and so on. Most of the allergy to building allergens is to house dust mites, and that has happened in a generation.
And I think you were saying, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think you were also saying that not too long ago, we didn't think that the dust mites would be basically everywhere. That, the high, dry mountains out in Denver, we probably wouldn't see them get to there, but apparently now they are. Is that accurate? Yeah,
well, yes, the short answer is yes. It's again, over my time of looking at this in detail, because I've been privileged to do studies in around 25,000 homes in Canada, is you just wouldn't see this in the driest parts of our continent in the winter, and now it's much more common. It's so a long journey of tightening our buildings up, which of course is a very good thing for energy management, accumulating dust, which is a very bad idea. And then these tropical creatures grow. So, but at least for me, I'm just north of 60. It's the most amazing thing, but something that almost literally didn't exist in when I was born is now a ubiquitous cause of allergic disease in our continent. So one of the things. So, with that said, I had a couple of points to make in your asking of the introductory question on it. Firstly, look how long it took to come to consensus about this. It took, from a bunch of wild and crazy guys saying that dust mites caused allergy, who were mocked. Frankly, again, I had the chance to see it myself. That it did take all that long time from say 20 years or a bit more to get absolute consensus. And now, if we ask the question today, do you think dust mites cause asthma? I think most people would be shocked I was asking the question. So a long journey. They had to be able to measure the agent in question in both the exposure in the building and in the population, and then they had to wait until there were many studies of the association in many countries, and when that happened, then you could say, yeah, house dust mites cause asthma and allergy. The second broad message is that for me, it's an icon of how much we have changed our housing in a generation, in less than a generation. In most respects, it's much better. But in many respects, we haven't always paid attention to the consequences of changes that were made.
I also would like to kind of tie this in with the mold just a little bit, because I want to start with the fact that the house dust mite, there's two types, correct? Just the two types of house dust mite?
That's correct, yes.
And one is more prevalent than the other? Is that accurate? Or?
No, it's actually, so what the point is, there's two species of house dust mites. One of them munches on skin scales, and every one of us sheds a teaspoonful of skin scales every 3 weeks or a month. So they just fall to the ground. In fact, it's so much that in a house, if you suck air and measure cholesterol, you can measure cholesterol in air because there's so much skin scale in the air. Wow. So that's house dust mite food for one of the species. And the other species is a little bit more generalist. The other species, Stomatophorgoides farinae, is a little bit more general, but it also likes skin scales. And they have a small difference in their preferred environmental conditions. One likes it a tad warmer than the other. In most places, though, in many, I would say it's true in most places, both are present. And you would only rarely find it that one is dominant now. So they are two species, but they like slightly different things, conditions.
I think it's important that you give this discussion prior to going into more on the mold topic, and that's why I was kind of pointing out there's two species of dust mite where we've got maybe more than 1 million species of mold. Mold exists in water-damaged environments, which will have more than just mold in it. And it took a long time to get from point A to where we are now with dust mites. And I wondered if you comment on how difficult doing the same thing is with mold.
Yeah, sure. But so I just want to add one more thing about the dust mite. So I do encourage everyone who's interested in this to get hold of the house dust mite parameter as it's published. It's open access, and I'm sure that, I don't know, Cliff can find a way to post it or whatever, the link. But so all the medical stuff has gone through in the house dust mite parameter, which in my judgment is a tour de force, and the leader of our committee, a really important and active academic allergist, Jay Portnoy, deserves an immense amount of credit for this effort. And it's in the publication. It's like 45 pages of text and 350 references. And then it goes through recommendations for diagnosis and treatment in a stepwise fashion with grades of evidence. Like, in other words, we recommend you do this, and the evidence is absolutely finest kind. So it's all organized that way. But on top of that, though, there was something really important that's new, and why I feel your community, Joe, should at least hear a little bit about the importance of these parameters. And that is, for the very first time, there's actually substantive discussion about the buildings in it in a medical context. And so there's obviously when you're sick, you can take drugs and take treatment, but there's also the issue of avoiding the exposure in this case that causes the problem. So I'm allergic to ragweed, and thus I'm taking antihistamines at the present time because I can't avoid the air in the outside world. Dust mites are essentially unavoidable in a building, but you can do a lot to make sure that they don't that the exposure to them goes to a much lower level than otherwise. So there's in practical terms, there's two, in my view, really exciting things in the parameter. One of them is that there's I promise you, a good discussion of the issue of relative humidity. So previous guidances on dust mites have indicated the fact that dust mites don't do all that well if the humidity is below a certain value. And so it was in the minds, as it is of many lay people, and God forbid some experts, that if you measure the RH in the center of the room, that's informative. But I suspect that most, if not all, of those listening today or will listen know full well that the temperature differences between walls, windows, and floors, whether you live in Louisiana or whether you live in Ottawa in the winter, that the walls, windows, and floors and the center of the room, the temperatures can be all over quite different. Mm-hmm. It's usually cooler. So what's clearly evidenced and explained in very good terms, I think, to the doctors is to tell the patients that they should, check the RH at different locations in their house to try to get a sense of whether what we might call there's condensing surfaces, that would elevate the humidity where the dust mites like to live, which it does include, of course, in fabric-covered furniture and floors. And the second thing that I think is incredibly important is that because house dust itself, all the different stuff that's in there, including skin scales, is quite hygroscopic. And if the floor is a little cooler down there, it means that's happy valley for the survival and proliferation of house dust mites. So when you walk across the carpet, the particles burst in the air and you get an exposure then. And that's absolutely been measured. People have put little samplers near the noses of people and showed where they're getting exposure to house dust mite. It's not all in their beds. So we tell them to, really make a big effort to reduce the fine dust in the carpets. So another thing to lay down about the dust mite parameter, and this is important in residential homes for health, is that we've explained and signaled to the physician community to try to get people to more effectively reduce exposure by taking a number of steps, one of which is cleaning with a good quality vacuum cleaner. And the other thing that we do we mean to be helpful to the physician, and this picks up on something you asked a second ago, Joe, is that there's a map, a Kloppen map, or like an ASHRAE map of the United States and Canada, that shows from epidemiology studies basically if you live in this part of the United States, what are the odds that your patient is going to be allergic to house dust mites? And that triggers, because that's based on medical evidence, that triggers, we hope, some some better discussion and education between doctor and patient.
And is this the first parameter that included other than methods other than treating them with medications, etc. that went into?
I would say the answer is, in detail, the answer is yes. I think it really was a big step forward. And the previous material from the allergy physicians was that humidity mattered, and that's true. But as this community knows, that where you measure humidity has a great deal matters a great deal to what the outcome will be. And I think that is very significant. And I think the specific evidence-based recommendation that that reducing exposure by taking some humidity management steps and by reducing fine particles in the carpet, which allow the growth of these creatures, not just letting them accumulate like other contaminants. I think that is in some ways transformative in that particular context.
And prior to breaking for halftime and then going into the same discussion with mold, I'm just curious, how controversial was getting that information into the dust mite parameter at the time?
Yeah. I think, firstly, I've emphasized that I've emphasized these parameters are developed with great care by demonstrated experts, and I think my feeling is that it wasn't so much controversial as a surprise.
Interesting. All right.
And so if I can just say
Please.
one more thing
Yes.
before we drop this, and that is that this is useful to those of you who go into buildings, because it allows in some way for you to say, well, the allergy doctors agree that, cleaning more effectively, and by which I mean particulate cleaning, not chemicals in particular, is good. I think that's the signal that this community needs to pay and also consider in their evaluations and their work.
Agreed.
Anyway,
very important. Very important. All right, we're going to break and take 90 seconds to thank our sponsors. We'll be back with the second half of our interview with Dr. J. David Miller in about 90 seconds. And thanks to our association sponsors, the Indoor Air Quality Association, a nonprofit multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Visit them at IAQA.org.
The Restoration and Specialty Cleaners Association, who have been serving the needs of and advocating for their members for over 30 years. Remember, Triska is your link to industry training, certification, standards, and events. Their website is trsca.org. Thanks to our advertisers.
Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com.
Legends Environmental Insurance Services, the experts in insurance for environmental consultants and contractors for over 20 years. Visit them at legends-enviro.com.
And Particles Plus. They are engineers and manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters, air quality monitoring instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
And, of course, our marquee sponsors. John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at their website, jondon.com. That's jondon.com.
CleanFacts, the #1 information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfacts.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their services and products.
Okay, we're back for the second half of our interview with Dr. J. David Miller. Professor Miller, let's get into the mold issue now. I don't know, prior to the break, we talked about there only being the two species of dust mite that you had to work with, and that, even though there are other particles, etc., that are found in the same, environment. It doesn't seem to me as it would be as complicated as trying to do the same thing for mold. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think most of us, and certainly me, who've been involved with the mold journey, shares some important features with the story I told you about dust mites, which is dead simple. And the first is that when the problem started to become a nuisance in the early 80s, and then in the next decade or so, again, there was the same cycle of anger, denial, resentment, acceptance that had to be gone through. People said anyone who thought that mold was a health problem in a building was crazy. And in fact, up in 1988, the same year that the WHO said dust mites were in fact a substantive problem, the ACHIH more or less said in their guidance that if mold was present in buildings, it was ugly, but not notably a health hazard. I was able to get them to change that the next year. Today, imagine someone saying that material growth of mold in a building wasn't a problem. But that's how long it really isn't that long ago that was the common wisdom. So there's no question that there's a lot of complexity there in general. And the journey there, of course, was that generally, in an official way, governments got onto this as a problem first, at least from a research perspective, and then I think arguably the industrial hygienists were the first large group to get really active, and by the middle of the 90s. Had issued, guidance not so long after the New York guidelines in 1992. Mm-hmm. And then that was, followed by arguably the engineering community, ASHRAE, and so on. And then public health communities, meaning the National Academy of Science report in 2004, and the WHO report ultimately in 2009. So it went from, this is no problem at all to some reasonably good consensus that there is a problem by, 2005, let's just say 11 years ago. And the material that the Quad-AI committee produced on mold, which was released in May and June of this year, is really arguably the first response of the relevant medical community to this as an issue that many of us have been trying to wrestle with for quite a while now. So the point I was trying to make there is that why only now is there any consideration at all? And part of it is that long journey of time and progression to the different professional communities had to be addressed, mainly because when you're treating someone, you don't want to make a mistake, and then secondly, because of what you said, Joe, the problems with the fact that the number of molds that are important in buildings is at least in the hundreds. Going through every one of them, identifying, what are the active agents, measuring them in exposed populations, measuring them in the environment, and doing the studies. As somebody who's been privileged to be given really large amounts of money to do these studies, it is so expensive to do this that, it takes a long time and is not, doesn't go very fast in terms of even getting awareness up there. So there's, in terms of how long it took to get some, consensus information out to physicians, it because the journey has to be done no matter what, regardless. All those steps have to be taken into account. Now, in terms of the specificity of the advice, how do you link those hundreds of species and conditions to particular health outcomes? That's enormously more difficult. And from a medical perspective or a clinical perspective, the hardest thing for that community and some public health communities to understand is that the health effects associated with fungi demonstrated in epidemiology studies well done all over the world in many populations from Japan to all over Scandinavia, and certainly in the United States and Canada, where we have big, powerful studies, the biggest and most, the largest studies in the most number of people of anywhere in the world, done since 1989 about, is that the health effects are strange. So with house dust mite allergy, you're going to be exposed if under certain conditions and your own genetics. You're going to acquire allergy. You're going to suffer symptoms. There are treatments for it. There are drugs for it. And as we discussed, there's some things you can do with your home. With mold, the signal right from the beginning epidemiologically was that if you live or work in a building with material amounts of mold damage, mold and dampness damage, that you're more likely to be allergic to everything. So that made no sense at all for about 25 years. If you think about it, you're allergic to dust mites, they're there, makes sense. If you're exposed in a large way to mold, you can acquire allergy to one of a number of fungi. I've demonstrated that after I discovered the allergens and measured them. But again, there are hundreds of them. But the signal is that if you live in or work in a material moldy building, that you're more likely to be allergic to dust mites, to pollen, to everything. And that really did make no sense. So wrestling with the idea that fungi in some way were different, is a huge challenge, and so the controversy in a medical context for me can be deconstructed that way. The epidemiology signals made no sense, and so what had to change is a lot of basic work had to be done, plus the epidemiology, to understand why that was. So I always say that when there's more storks born, this is true, there are more babies born. So when you have correlations, you need to know whether storks come from babies or not, or if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So the long journey part of it here was because the nature of the health signal was more complex, and there was at the time no idea at all of what a mechanism could be. And it's only recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, that there's been some fairly good resolution. Not completely, of course. That'll take another 5 or 6 or 10 years, but at least we have, in a quantal sense, why we might see those epidemiological signals.
Well, let's go ahead and follow up on that. What do we know now in the last 3 or 4 years that we didn't know before?
Yeah. So, I just want to drift back then to cockroaches.
Okay.
So cockroaches make an allergen. I think that makes sense, and no one who lives in the southeast of the U.S. would not know that. Likely, there aren't any cockroaches to speak of where I live. It's too cold, so far anyway. But there's something else that is seen. There's also a health effect that's seen that ultimately is attributed to the thing their shell is made out of, which is a form of chitin. So chitin is a polymer, and it's pretty tough. Like, as I'm sure everybody knows, you see a dead cockroach and the cockroach shell is there. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But it will break up into tiny pieces. And it turns out that there's populations of humans and animals that have in their genome the ability to express an enzyme that breaks that polymer into little pieces. Now, God only knows, and I mean that in a Christian way or a theological way, why that is. It just is. Much like we have a receptor for the fungal glucan. We don't know why we have it, but we have it. It's one of the reasons why there are health issues with fungi. And it turns out that when you breathe a tiny fragment of chitin, it breaks into pieces, and those pieces turn on systems that are inflammatory. Again, it's lost in the midst of time why that should be, but that's harmful. So one of the things that in the cockroach parameter that was new to the allergy community, at least the broad allergy community, was that there are part of the health signal from cockroaches comes from this problem that there's in some asthmatic populations there's the potential to degrade the chitin in the fragments that you breathe, and that contributes to the health effect. So it turns out that the same broad thing happens with fungi, except it's worse. And there's pretty easy to think about it. One of them is that they're also made out of a form of chitin. They're the outer walls, the strong walls, fungal chitin, you could call it. Mm-hmm. And when it breaks down, same deal. They contain the molds that grow in buildings, at least the ones that are like Aspergillus penicillium, that type of fungus, make a particular form of another polymer, which is called beta-1,3-D-glucan. And it turns out that we have a glucan, or it's called a dectin receptor in medicine. And again, we don't know why we have it, but it turns out that if you turn it on, it causes inflammation. So two of the exposures that you get in a moldy building, whereas I'm sure everybody in this call knows about that most of the exposure is to tiny fragments of the fungi that break apart, is that it's actually turning on switches that exist and that connect to inflammatory pathways. So inflammation on your skin, if you cut yourself and it turns all red, well, that has good and bad effects. When it happens in your lungs, it's essentially universally bad, almost always bad. Another thing that fungi have is, of course, they do make allergens. There are occupational illnesses associated with fungal allergy. People have known about that for centuries, actually. And, the thing is, we know a lot about the allergens of the fungi that occur in outdoor air. And really, until people like me came along, no one cared whether the fungi that most of us know and love in buildings actually make allergens. So they make allergens, and people get allergic to it. And I know that because I've been able to measure antibodies in the sera of atopic individuals in hundreds, thousands of serum samples that mainly come from the U.S. So people are definitely exposed, and if you're allergic to something, including pollen for hay fever, it's a health effect. the third and most unattractive part is that fungi are rather more related to us than cockroaches or dust mites, and many of their enzymes are awfully similar to ours, and but not totally similar to ours. And our immune system reacts unfavorably to that. So it's a complex story, but the big picture is that there are particular agents that we can measure and know about more. We know quite a bit about how they act on receptors in our lungs, and they are turning on broadly inflammatory pathways, and that is that in short is bad. None of the other allergens, other than the small example of the chitin and the cockroaches, furry pets, rodents, dust mites, they don't do this. And so it was that change in understanding that fungi are different that allowed us to be a little bit more connect the information about damp buildings and health to a medical community in a more effective way.
Now, one of the other topics that regularly comes up when we discuss mold in buildings is mycotoxins, and you are world renowned for working with and understanding mycotoxins. I'm wondering if you could comment on, I had a question which was basically, can people in a water-damaged building inhale enough mycotoxin to cause health effects? But I don't know if that's the right question. Why don't I just ask you to comment on that topic?
Well, I think it's a perfectly good question. It's a question that's been asked since, 25 years. The early people who were ordered when I worked for the Canadian government, somebody came to my office and said, "You're going to work on moldy buildings." And I said, "I don't think so." And they said, "Yeah, you are." so most, and the same in the U.S., the NIOSH folks that were first tasked to get involved, they had previously been working in the context of, agricultural workers and exposures. So it's a question that's been asked right from the beginning. So here is what I would say, and I said you saw me say this in Boulder, so at least you can correct me if I'm changing my tune. But what I said is that here's the things that we believe matter a lot, which are the form of glucan that's in fungi, the other polymer, beta 1,3-D glucan, the allergens from the fungi, and the enzymes that are really rather too similar to ours. And then I did bring up that indeed fungi that grow in damp buildings make not mycotoxins in the same sense as in the strict sense of that word, which is exclusively really reserved for the toxins that occur in corn and peanuts and wheat and so on, but are certainly low molecular weight compounds that have toxicities, and we know that as you're exposed to the chitin and the glucan and the allergens, there will be some exposure to those compounds, and how then the question is, are there effects of that? And the answer is, at least in laboratory animals in doses that are theoretically possible in buildings, the answer is yes, there are effects. But the real question there is, how much does it matter? And so the way that at least I think about that is that the things that I've emphasized so far, which are the form of chitin and glucan, the allergens, and these other proteins that are present in fungi that are that are distressingly similar to some of ours, that they matter the most. So probably they're explaining 90% of the unusual health signal that one sees in fungi. Now, whether it's 85 or 95 or 75 or 99, 1% rather, that is not known, and because that would vary by individual and circumstance. But so it would be wrong to say that the low molecular weight compounds have no impact whatsoever, but they're not in any way seen, at least today, as a major driver of the population health signal that occurs. I do want to say, though, that if you are remediating heavily molded material, cardboard boxes and cellulosic material that you would reasonably expect a lot of, and I'm going to say it, Stachybotrys on it, and you weren't wearing personal protection and you were carrying that material, you are absolutely going to get enough of an exposure to cause explicit damage from the metabolites it makes, which are extremely toxic compounds. And now I do submit who would do such a stupid thing today in 2016. But is it flat out impossible to get a big dose? It clearly isn't. People have studied the exposure if you're not wearing a respirator, and it turns out, unsurprisingly, if you're carrying, highly molded material close to your chest, that you get one wicked dose of it, and that is absolutely bad, right from and there the metabolites might matter quite a bit.
And how would that exposure manifest in would the people have headache? Would they have bleeding?
Oh no, they get really, really sick.
Okay.
You'd be going to the hospital.
I see.
And in a way, I mean, let's remember, why did New York City? Why is New York the father of the mold guidelines, or at least the guidelines that came out of our committee in New York? Why have they stood the test of time? Mold is bad. If you got a mold problem, fix the water.
So were there specific...
clean it up under safe conditions and reduce the particulate. It was because some municipal workers had been assigned the task of cleaning out basements in municipal facilities that had been flooded and turned into a mold factory. And people ended up some of the workers in Mount Sinai, in the Selikoff Institute, which is how they got interested to offer some advice in this area. So yeah, you get really sick.
And the other thing that I wanted to ask is, it seems like the allergy and asthma effects are more related to immune system type responses. With the mycotoxin issue, and you deal with this a lot with grain and so on and so forth, is the biggest concern cancer, or is it more immediate health effects?
No, but so again, in the context I described, and I do want to, hopefully there's enough minutes to say a couple of things about the inspection part of our mold advice, not just the health effects. Is very low exposures do contribute to the inflammatory process. They are not, the dose is nowhere near enough of any compound unless you're sniffing it, as I described, not wearing a respirator and handling and disturbing moldy materials for enough time. Nowhere near enough for a health effect, at least not in my opinion. That would be overly dramatic. The things that we know are the things that I've discussed.
Okay. And
so I did want to, I know that we're hopefully almost done, but for this community, I did want to say that there's something I think really important. So about fungi, we produced 5 separate papers that look at health effects, look at the mechanistic stuff that Joe asked me about. Really good, I think, paper that's for physicians to help them discern in a few questions based on evidence, like the dust mites ones I described, from their patients whether it would make sense to have their house inspected by somebody who's knowledgeable. And there's some information given about what knowledgeable means, at least in our perspective. And that's really important because it could mean that there will be some more emphasis placed for at least those who can afford it to come out and have somebody look at your house for things that you can see, and I think that's a huge step forward. But the other thing is that there's a paper that discusses medically relevant home inspections, and I do encourage those of you who do that to get access to it, because there's things that physicians need to hear that normally we might not give if we're inspecting, for an engineering reason or for an insurance reason. There's specific types of information that physicians need to hear, and there's specific things that they absolutely don't want to be told. In other words, don't give any medical judgments and things like that. Mm-hmm. And there's a list of the kinds of questions that go to really a gold standard home inspection for medicine. So again, as we all know, there's good ones for industrial hygiene. There's good ones if you're, a contractor and you're trying to spec a job. There's good inspections if you're dealing with an insurance company. But there are some things that are different and different kinds of information that physicians need to hear. And these are really described. So I think it's a great opportunity to improve the quality of the inspections that we do and the work that we do all together.
Is there also guidance in there on the remediation once the inspection is done? Not any more than you don't already see. I mean, the guidance is congruent with the Green Book, with other similar publications, as you would expect. And so basically there's a reference to the appropriate, incorporation of appropriate ideas that have, been evolved in our practitioner community for the last decade or so, particularly. Of course, there is emphasis placed on the fine particle cleaning for obvious reasons. And there's, cautions about, chemical use and again, some language about how you would evaluate if the person is appropriately qualified. It's much more that the nature and the particular kinds of information that is needed by a physician to move forward is a little different than and actually in some ways very different from some of the other purposes that we do this work for. And one of the things that makes this a little tough is that I believe the Journal for Allergy and Clinical Immunology, you would have to pay for those papers. Is there a way?
Yeah.
And if it had gotten into a practice parameter, which we didn't even really get a chance to talk about, whether that will happen or not, it would be out for the public to use and for our.
Yeah.
Any comments on how?
That's a very good point, and certainly anyone who is that is how it is. That's how it is for most of the scientific literature. So I've offered two answers, I guess. One of them is, of course, any one of the authors is on an individual basis is quite free to provide a copy. There is a way to make the manuscript version available more broadly, mm-hmm. And since you've raised this, I'll look into that. And another thing that at least some of us are doing is going out there and talking about this work. So I've never been to an IQA meeting, but I, with some others from the task force, will be speaking at the meeting in the winter. So I think that we're sensitive to the need to push this out there. And but if you know one of the authors, you can ask for a copy.
I appreciate that. And we are getting we're a little bit over right now. Do you have to run anywhere? I've got one text question that...
all right, go ahead.
All
sure.
right. Is IgG testing of value when understanding an immune reaction to mold? If so, why does AAAI recommend to physicians that they don't test IgG? I don't know how quickly you can cover that, if you can.
Okay, well, I mean, I'd need to understand where the questioner's coming from. When you, if you're allergic to something, there's a cascade of immunological reactions that includes making IgG and then IgE, so the tricky thing is that depends a bit on the timing of your exposure. So right now, undoubtedly, the IgE in my serum to ragweed allergen is quite high because I'm being challenged for the probably 2 weeks our ragweed season will last. Mm-hmm. In the middle of the winter, I would absolutely know that there would be rather negligible amounts of the IgE to the allergen for ragweed in my serum. So there's always a temporality there that is difficult to address. But I've already indicated that the primary reason for the panel not endorsing, not saying that makes sense, and the primary reason, Joe, is one that you've raised from the beginning. There's certainly hundreds of fungi that are present in buildings, and as you know from watching the stuff at the molecular biology meeting, our understanding of what the diversity is actually doesn't make everything we knew wrong, but it's actually telling us there's a good deal more there than we imagined. And so that's the really huge problem is that instead of one thing that has to be measured for IgE or even IgG, it's actually so many that a negative doesn't mean necessarily anything, both because of timing and because there's just so many fungi.
Okay. And that I also noticed, and I wanted to let listeners know, one of the papers was actually a recategorizing of how we look at the fungi, at least the allergenic fungi. That was an interesting paper. We'll of course have the link to the at least the abstracts in Cliff's blog. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that for those of us out here who do this work and we have mold allergies, it appears, at least from your answer to my email, that going in and getting shots to build up some kind of resistance to that or whatever is probably not in the cards at this point.
Well, as since you're an expert on this now, Joe, you know that which organism would we choose,
yep.
and do we know anything about it? And the answer is probably who knows and probably not. So.
But and the reason I bring that up is I think it again goes to what you've been saying all along here. This new information makes it even more important that we as professionals, what we do becomes more important, and also that we do it and follow the guidelines that will help the physicians out there is very important.
And just to reinforce that, this is the first time that this thinking of the importance of building science and building knowledgeable people about buildings is a critical piece of how best to treat those patients. It's a big step forward. It'll take a while for it to be incorporated, but it's a big step forward.
And with that, I think that's a perfect spot to end. I want to thank today's guest, Dr. J. David Miller, and I hope we can get you back again and it's not 6 or 8 years down the road.
Okay.
Thanks again for joining us. I also want to say thanks to my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. I'm sure your hand is a little sore right now from writing notes on this one. I'm looking forward to the blog. My engineer, John, you got to have faith. Things seem to have gone real well. It sounded like we had good sound today, so I think we'll have a great recording for people up very soon. Most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners. Hey, come back next week at noon. Next Friday at noon, we're going to have our 10-year anniversary show, and we look forward to having a lot of live listeners on that day, just like today. So this is Radio Joe saying thanks to everyone. We'll see you next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio.
Hello, Joe.
This has been another IAQ Radio production.